Welcome to Get on My Corner, the show where we uncover the corners of our world where history was made and the inventions that shaped our world first took root.
And today, we're on the corner that didn't just change this city, it helped shape the world. Now, you've heard of the United Nations, right? Peacekeeping, diplomacy, and the backdrop to quite a few action films.
But what you might not know is that the founding of the United Nations, the very first UN, it didn't happen over in New York. It all happened right here in San Francisco in the year 1945.
A few weeks after the end of World War II, 50 nations gathered right here in this very city, bringing with them ambitions, anxieties, and hope for a better future. It was not perfect, not by any means, but it was bold. And it all started right here on this very corner.
So let's take a step back to that moment, and we'll explore the diplomacy, the debates, the drama, and that uniquely San Francisco spirit that helped to launch a global institution.
Because history isn't just found in the headlines or the textbooks, no. Sometimes it's right on the corner where you're standing. And so for you laddie-longy lovers, the cool kids latitude and longitude, you can find the coordinates right here below. So look it up, I know you wanna. Come on, let's do it.
Because this is Get on My Corner, the birth of the United Nations.
Almost every corner has a story. You walk past history every day without even knowing it. We are here to bring those corners to life. So go on and get on my corner.
Hey everyone. Now before you go on to the comments, we just want to acknowledge that we understand the importance of keeping a steady table during a Zoom interview. We apologize. At this corner of the world, we are learning and growing as we go, and we promise that we are going to do better next time. Also, keep a lookout for my little flub. Think of it as like a blooper teaser because it's coming up.
Welcome back to Get on My Corner. Now, we've talked about the founding of the United Nations, but now it's time to hear from somebody who wrote the book on it, literally.
Joining us now is scholar and UN expert Dr. Stephen Schlesinger. He is the author of Act of Creation, the definitive book on the founding of the United Nations right here in San Francisco.
So we've got him joining the show virtually. Welcome to Get on My Corner, Dr. Schlesinger.
Thank you for having me.
Now, tell us a little bit about the founding and why was San Francisco chosen as the location in 1945 for the UN?
Well, the reason the UN conference was held in San Francisco, there's a little anecdote that explains it. It's a curious one and hard to believe, but in fact, this is what happened. At 3 months before the conference began, Franklin Roosevelt, our president at that time, had a famous meeting with Stalin and Churchill at Yalta to figure out the final details of the conference on the United Nations. And while at that conference, Roosevelt had brought along his Secretary of State named Edward Stettinius. Stettinius woke up one morning having had a dream, and in the dream he said, "We should have the conference in San Francisco," simply because he loved the city of San Francisco. Well, Roosevelt thought about it at first, wasn't sure about why that particular city, but the more he thought about it, the more he thought that would fit the circumstances of the day, because the Second World War had ended in Europe, but it was still going on in the Pacific. And so by having the meeting in San Francisco, attention would be paid to what's going on against Japan as the war was still going forward in that area. And so eventually he thought, well, this is a genius idea. It also would give more attention to the West Coast. Most of the events of the war had been happening on the East Coast of America, but here it was a chance to make prominent the place of all of the Western states, and it certainly, as I said, address the issue of the Pacific War.
So you've kind of talked about the broader climate and some of the reasons that Roosevelt wanted to bring it here, but could you talk a little bit about like what was the climate here in San Francisco? Were people happy, excited? Like how did the locals feel about this thing coming to town?
The locals were very impressed that this whole remarkable meeting was happening in San Francisco, their little town. They didn't really expect to be heralded in this way. You may recall that the population of San Francisco around that time was around 600,000, but there was an additional couple 100,000 of soldiers in San Francisco and sailors and people who were involved in the fight against Japan. So the issue of the war was very much on the minds of San Franciscans. They saw the military every day in the streets, and they were thrilled that this whole event was going to be held exactly in their home city, and it would be a worldwide occasion for countries all over the globe to appear and attend. So there was a sense of very grave excitement about this whole gathering.
So with these countries coming together and the founding members, there were about 50, which were surprising and controversial at that time? And generally, like, what were the countries that were invited?
The countries that were chosen to come to the meeting had to have done one thing. They had to have declared that they were against the Nazi regime and the Japanese regime in order to qualify for attendance. And that really basically meant that several countries right away were going to be excluded, that were either fighting on the other side or would remain neutral. Most of the countries, therefore, got in very easily. There was one or two that I would consider controversial. One was the issue of Argentina. Now, Argentina had stayed neutral during the Second World War, and there was a great deal of opposition to including Argentina in the meeting. But the Latin American bloc wanted Argentina to be added to the list. All the other countries of Latin America had been admitted, and they felt that even though Argentina was neutral, that it was towards the end starting to turn against Germany. And therefore, they wanted to make a big case of it. And in the end, despite the opposition, the Latin together as a bloc, they said they threatened to actually walk out if Argentina was not admitted. And eventually they won, and Argentina did become one of the members at the conference. That was also true. There was a controversy also about two countries which are part of the Soviet Union at that time, Belarus and Ukraine, oddly enough. They had been regarded as simply occupied lands of the Soviet Union with no independent sovereignty. But the Russians were saying that if Argentina was going to be admitted, they wanted to have their two countries also added to the list. And they also insisted that if they didn't get their way, they would walk out. And so eventually, the United States and other countries agreed to make a deal, basically. Argentina in exchange for Ukraine and Belarus. And so therefore, three countries that were otherwise considered very controversial were included in the final agenda of countries.
Today, I want to thank our sponsor, Billy Clean. Billy Clean is a 100% natural, waterless, rinseless hand and body soap. For those that don't know, I am a first-time father to an infant baby girl that was born about a month ago, and I want to keep her safe. So my Billy Clean kills about 99% of staph and E. coli while still keeping the healthy flora in my hand. So what I do is right before I change my little girl's diaper or feed her or just handle her in general, I take a pump, put it on my hand, cover it back up, and then I rub it in. And all you have to do is rub it for about 8 to 10 seconds, and then bam, it is done, ready to go. I don't have to go to the bathroom, I don't have to rinse anything off. It just is clean, and it has been lab tested to be as clean as using soap and water, just like in the bathroom. And then I change my little girl's diaper, everything is good. I feel really confident that she is safe, that she is healthy, that she is clean, and I have done my job to be a responsible parent. So go on mybillyclean.com, type in Get On My Corner, and you get 50% off your entire purchase. So thank you, Billy Clean.
I wonder if you could talk about the broader power dynamics and kind of decision-making structure, how they kind of counterbalance maybe the bigger, more dominant countries with smaller companies, recently liberated countries, and how that all kind of played off each other.
We have to remember that this conference was actually organized by the victors of the Second World War, primarily United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, China, and France. Um, Now, China and France themselves had been devastated by the war, so while they were considered sponsors, they were still recovering from grave damage that they'd suffered there. But basically, the idea was that these five countries would be not only the sponsors of this organization, but we would be singled out as the only countries that would have the veto and have permanent presence on the UN Security Council. Why? Because the idea that Franklin Roosevelt introduced was that there should be these five countries should be the policemen of the world. The great era that had occurred in the previous iteration of a global security organization, namely the League of Nations, which came out of the First World War, was that every country in the League had the veto, which meant that any rogue nation could block anything that the League came up with, and engender a hollowness in the whole point of the League. It didn't have much power if a single nation said, "Hey, I'm not interested. Let's veto it." But Roosevelt said, "Why not have the five countries, the most powerful survivors of the Second World War, not only be the organizers, but be the ones who make the final decisions on war and peace inside what is now called the UN Security Council, and that these five countries should have permanent membership, and the only countries that should have the veto." One of the reasons he pointed to them was that he felt after the devastation of the Second World War, these were the only countries that had militaries that were still effective and therefore could carry out UN missions in the future. Anyway, for all those reasons, that became the biggest controversy at the UN meeting in San Francisco. But it became the power dynamic at that time. And eventually, the smaller countries, despite the fact that they weren't going to get the veto, that they were not permanent members of the UN Security Council, that they were not really being paid heed in the way they wanted to, decided that it was better to let the United States and the Soviet Union and the others get their way, because if they didn't get their way, they wouldn't have joined the UN in the first case. And that meant that the UN would go the way of the League of Nations. It would have been a hollowed out organization without the United States in particular in membership, because the United States, as you remember, did not join the League after it had come into formation. So you did have a situation where you had the big powers versus the smaller powers, and the big powers dominated the meeting.
What was one of the main reasons that the UN eventually relocated from San Francisco to New York City?
Well, after San Francisco concluded, and everybody agreed at the end that it had been successful, that the delegates coming to San Francisco had adopted a charter, a UN charter, which they all agreed on, and it was just a matter for the charter to be sent back to each of the countries' parliaments or legislatures to make the final ratification in each individual nation. But basically, the issue was completed, and they had the deal in hand. Now, where were they going to have the headquarters? Well, first of all, Roosevelt, among others, thought maybe it ought to be on some sort of island. So if you had an island, it would be isolated from, the political storms of other countries. It would be just to be able to focus on the issues of the day. But eventually, most of the countries started to realize, it had to be inside a country. It had to be in kind of concert with the issues of the day, with the people who were going to be involved in the eventual um, building of this assembly. And the issue was kicked around a lot. Many people thought maybe it ought to be in the United States. And the reason why many came to that conclusion was that because they felt that if the United States had the UN building in one of its cities, it would not have the option to leave the organization as it had when the League of Nations was set up. It would be kind of stuck with the building right in an American municipality, and it would therefore have to live up to its agreement to participate. And you have to remember that the United States had been a great country of isolationism up until the Second World War. And so many of these countries were basically saying, hey, this is a way to prevent the US from ever going isolationist again. And eventually, New York became the choice. And the reason why, because the famous Rockefeller family agreed to buy land in Manhattan for the placement of the building. And that was a very expensive deal at that time, and nobody had the money to do something like that. But once it was provided free of charge, so to speak, it landed New York as the obvious choice and a place where all the people around the world knew New York would be fun to be there. It would be considered the kind of capital city of the world, and it sort of fit the bill. And therefore, New York became the headquarters of the UN building.
The UN plays such a central role in conflict on the world scale. What role did the UN play in the conflict between Jill Zarin and Bethany Frankel from the Real Housewives of New York?
I tell you, that's still in debate at the UN Security Council. I mean, it's one of the more pressing issues facing the council right now. So we're waiting breathlessly for an answer.
Well, I'm glad they have their priorities in check. Thank you. Can you trace back any global policies or principles during the time that the UN was in San Francisco?
Well, I think that San Francisco put the final finish on the UN Charter. So in that sense, whatever was passed and enacted and agreed on in San Francisco among the 50 countries which were there became the features that we know today in the UN Charter. So in that sense, all the outlines of what we know about the organization 80 years later are still from the deal that was made in the glorious city of San Francisco. Now that doesn't mean that there weren't changes made over those 80 years since the event in the Golden City, but it does mean that the basic features of the UN were set at the UN conference. So no, what happened in San Francisco is what's happening today in the UN.
Are there any global conflicts in the years following the formation of the UN, or just like global political happenings that would have played out very differently, gone worse, gone better, had the UN not been there in 1945 and onward? If the timing had been different, the formation different, things like that.
Well, I can mention a few. I don't think that the North Korean invasion of South Korea, which happened in 1950, I don't think that the UN, without the UN, we would not have had a united world fighting North Korea to knock it out of South Korea after its invasion. That's one crisis I can think of right off the bat. Another is the famous Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the UN played the mediator role between the Soviet Union and the U.S. administration under John Kennedy in settling the whole issue of missiles in Cuba, which were threatening the security of the United States. Clearly, if without the UN's existence, there might not have been that settlement, and we might have been in a third world war. So I could cite other instances where the UN plays a role simply by providing an arena, a platform for countries with differing viewpoints on disputes, that they can come together peacefully and settle them within the boundaries of the UN Charter at the New York headquarters. And there have been plenty of times where the UN has in the past settled smaller conflicts, whether it's in places like Guatemala or Cambodia or El Salvador or Mozambique or Angola. I mean, I can name maybe 30 different countries where the UN played a peacekeeping role, provide the negotiators for the two warring parties to come together and reach an agreement. Yeah, I think the UN, without the UN, we would have, I believe, had another cataclysmic war, but worse than we've ever encountered because it would have involved nuclear weapons.
When will Mariah Carey actually be the UN Goodwill Ambassador?
Well, she's got to beat out all these other Hollywood luminaries who've been ambassadors, Michael Douglas, Angela Jolie. I mean, there are a whole bunch of them. So she's got to, measure up.
Well,
I think she's a much better singer than Michael Douglas.
I think you're probably right.
So there's a really big day coming up. It's the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. What are your plans for that day?
Well, I'm very excited because the UN has asked me to participate in the anniversary. Uh, First of all, the fact that it's survived for 80 years is quite remarkable. Most of these organizations die after 20 years. So it touches a nerve in the human community, the fact that it's still surviving. But second of all, I wrote a book about the founding of the UN and why the San Francisco conference was such a success. My book is called Act of Creation. As a result of that, the UN came to me and asked me if I would do a 5-minute video talking about the origins of the organization. I recorded that a couple of weeks ago, and it will be shown on June 26th in New York at the UN building when the UN actually celebrates its 80th anniversary. Why was June 26th chosen as the date? Because that was the final day of the San Francisco conference back in 1945, the wind-up day. And so this seemed the right time to give that 80th greeting to what happened in San Francisco, but here in New York. So my 5-minute video will introduce the meeting. And then during the summer, the UN will have an exhibition of photos from San Francisco throughout July, August, and September. That exhibition will be at the Visitor Center at the UN building in New York. So if you're in New York, please come by. And my video will also play during those 3 months at the exhibit. So I feel that I'm a participant. I'm thrilled with it. And I think it's remarkable that we're celebrating the 80th year of this organization.
That's amazing. I hope
Yeah.
you do a TikTok dance in your video. The UN. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Dr. Stephen Schlesinger. It was amazing for you to shed some light on this corner of San Francisco.
Thank you.
Did you catch it? Oh, I know. I think I'm the star, but the reality is, Dr. Schlesinger, it was amazing for us to have you on our show. So thank you for being our guest, and I want to personally apologize for my little flub up. Thank you so much.
So what started right here on this corner, it wasn't just a conference, it was a global turning point. The first steps towards cooperation in a world that had been divided by war.
50 nations, one vision for peace, and it all started right here in San Francisco in this very building.
So a huge thank you to Dr. Schlesinger for joining us today and helping to bring this corner of history to life.
And thank you for joining us, because history isn't just found in the halls of government. No, it comes alive in the corners you pass every day and the stories we share.
So if you have a corner that you think the world should know about, let us know. All the links are in the show notes.
Until next time, you better
Get on my corner.